Good afternoon. My name is Lana Woolf, and I am the woman behind Community Powered Responses. And this afternoon, I am doing an Unplugged webinar on using story circles as an evaluation method. Firstly, I want to just acknowledge that I am in Melbourne, Australia, also known as Nam. I'm on the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So today's webinar on using story circle as an evaluation method is the objectives really are what is a story circle or answering the question, what is a story circle? And answering the question, how can you evaluate projects using story circles? So we'll just start off with this quote. Story circles are more about listening than telling. There is not enough listening going on in evaluation. Reflection makes for good evaluation. And it's from Donna Porterfield, who is a community arts development practitioner in Ireland and considers stories a part of traditional Irish culture, a very oral tradition, a very oral culture, and uses story circles as for many, many things as well, including evaluation. So the first question was, what is a story circle? And very, very simply, a story circle is a group of people sitting around telling personal stories led by a story circle facilitator. Very simply, that's what it is. And stories are an incredibly big part of human culture. We tell stories all of the time. We tell stories on how we slept last night, what our morning was like, how we got to work. We probably tell hundreds of stories a day. And so story is a very embedded part of our culture. It's how we understand the world is through story. And the stories that we're able to tell ourselves and others, those we can understand and imagine, define not only what we believe to have already occurred, but also what we believe to be possible in our individual and collective lives. Story circles engender an appreciation for each participant's unique intellectual, emotional, and spiritual qualities, and develop oral expression and listening skills. And this is why I believe that story is a really, really useful tool to use in international and local community development projects. The story circle methodology that I use is deceptively simple. However, it's really important to recognize that stories are really powerful. Narrative is really powerful. And in fact, some of the work I do is on narrative power analysis and taking, the idea of power and the idea of power analysis into the narrative world as well. And so we need to be really careful because stories can be easily used for exploitation or tokenism rather than collective development. It's important to kind of understand that the way that I use story and story circles, I'm incredibly formal in my approach. There are guidelines on how to facilitate a story circle and consider power dynamics. And I deliver story circle training to facilitators, but also make sure that participants are clear on the purpose, the rules, and the process of a story circle. And I do that because story circles, as we'll get to, can be incredibly democratic methods, but you need to have really strong scaffolding to have the the full, I guess, impact of using Story Circle. Story circles can be used for many participatory research or community development aspects. And I've used it in many different ways. There's different types of cultural storytelling methodologies as well. So for example, as a Fijian Australian, I also use really explicitly Talanoa as a research methodology, as a community development methodology, and all sorts of things. I also use traditional story circles. I don't use methodologies, cultural methodologies that I'm not a part of that culture. But there are many different types of cultural story methodologies that do exist. And it's really useful to think about which ones you would be able to use, or perhaps your colleagues and so forth, depending on their culture, their ethnicity, their heritage. To be able to kind of have a bit of a glimpse of how I use, for example, Talanoa as a research methodology or a community development tool, I do have a video on using stories as a participatory research and community development tool. One of the key rules for storytelling as any kind of way that you want to use it, in this case, as a methodology for evaluation, it's really important to be clear on what the purpose of the storytelling circle is. And so in one part, really clear on the purpose that it's evaluation, that you're evaluating something, what it is that you're evaluating. And so it's really important for people to know or to determine within the group the theme of the particular storytelling, this particular story circle. So, again, this is such a collaborative process that if you can use the story circle to develop the purpose of the evaluation and then the evaluation as well. It's really important to be transparent about the rules of the story circle so that everybody's on the same page and they know what they're doing. And just to be really open in answering participants' questions. And doing so really allows for that informed consent, the informed part of informed consent. But also because when people are fully engaged and consenting, you can get such wonderful information and evaluation from this process. So how can you evaluate projects using a story circle? And I guess the first thing it is like any evaluation, is to understand or create a story circle to set goals for the project. If you're really clear on what the goals of the project are, then you can be much more clear on what it is that you're evaluating. And so for a fully collaborative participatory approach, you can create and use a story circle to set the goals of the project. And when I say you, I mean, it could be you, it could be stakeholders, it could be a variety of different stakeholders, or it could just be the community that you're working with. And one way to do that is what we call foreshadowing, is thinking about the future. And I think it's really important to know that you can refine, or participants can refine their goals in the project. So in a deeply collaborative way, involving stakeholders in defining meaningful outcomes together and grounding the process in shared and evolving understandings of the interrelated goals that are going on. And I think this is the best way, because if you don't have all of the stakeholders there, then there's going to be competing goals. There's going to be competing evaluation expectations. And we'll talk about that at the end. what's really great about this process is that it supports iterative, I guess, processes within projects. You can do an evaluation story circle, not just at the end, like the goal circle at the beginning and the evaluation circle at the end, but you can continue it along. And if you set the project up in that kind of iterative way, it means that you can facilitate these types of evaluation story circles several times to allow the goals to develop and change while new learning occurs. And I do want to acknowledge that that's often not how development projects work. Often you're in some big city office developing a theory of change that is coming out of someone's head, the goals of the project, the monitoring, learning and evaluation, and it's not really grounded in the community. And there's really no space for that iterative nature. But to be really inclusive and participatory means to be iterative, I think, for me anyway. And so it does support that iterative nature. And, you can do that really simply by thinking about, well, what you learnt, what you did, and what you needed. And think about that across different points of the project, whether it's time-bound or activity-bound or whatever it is. And then towards the end, you can create a story circle to evaluate the project. For example, thinking about what was the purpose, what was the process, what were the successes, what were the challenges, or thinking about it in terms of what are the stories of impact on the community. And from that point, you can write reports that combine summaries of the stories and the participants' voices, highlighting perspectives and experiences. So, just to give a little bit of examples, both of these examples from within Australia, working in local community development. And the first one was with the Pacifica community in Central Queensland. It was when I worked in the peak body of community mental health in Queensland. And I was asked to come into a project because a small organisation had gotten some funding because they were going to work with those Pacific Islanders, because don't you know, those Pacific Islanders have a lot of stigma towards mental health. And they went to the community and kind of said that, and the community said, who do you think you are? We don't need you to come to us in this way. This is really disrespectful. We don't want to work with you. And so they came to us, the peak body of community mental health. And as someone who's both Pacific Islander and participatory in the way that I work, I was asked to step in and take over. And so having some cultural background, I organised a meetup, I organised food, I organised a telenovela session, and I didn't talk about mental health or mental illness or stigma. I talked about well-being. And so we had a telenovela session, which is a cultural kind of storytelling process. And tell me a time when you felt connected to family, community, spirituality. And they told lots of stories about food, about eating together, about fishing together, about picnics. And then I was able to then ask story questions that related to those things, about telling me a story about how we can be connected as a community. And from this process, the group decided to have monthly community dinners and telenovela sessions where they could talk about a particular theme that was linked to wellbeing each month. And so we, again, throughout the whole kind of project, we didn't talk about mental illness. We talked about wellness. And through that, we were we did a lot of storytelling about that. So to help people connect in with, I guess, their strategies around supporting good mental health. And through that process also, we had story circles evaluating this process and thinking about, well, what's working here? What is not working here around these gatherings supporting our health, and what do we need to do differently? Another really interesting example of a story circle is with the staff of STARTS, which is the New South Wales Service for the Treatment of Rehabilitation of Torture and Trauma Survivors. Often, not always, but often it is with communities that are refugees or asylum seekers. And I was asked to come in to support staff to build their capabilities around different community arts methodologies, including story. And we did some of that work, and then we had an evaluation story circle. And so we had a circle where we all had to share a story of what you learned, a story of what you did with that learning, and then a story about what you need to continue using to use these methods in your work. And there was one person in that process who was there because she was told she had to be. She kind of wasn't very engaged in the process and didn't really believe in the community arts processes, thought they were a bit hokey pokey. And she chose not to participate in the first two story circles evaluation. And the last one, tell me a story of what you need to continue using these methods in your workplace, is after we went through the last story circle, and again, she refused to participate. She just passed, and that's okay. You can pass. And at the end, we're just kind of grounding ourselves after hearing all of the circles, she said, "See, it doesn't work. I told you that it doesn't work because I didn't tell my story, and I didn't tell any of the stories in the evaluation." And she then talked about how she didn't do that because she was really scared of using the story circle process, because she didn't know in this process, she was still confused about how to ensure people don't tell stories, personal stories of trauma, and then re-traumatize themselves, rather than focusing on really explicit questions around story circles or around evaluation or themes other than trauma. And it was really interesting because actually what she'd done was she told me a story about what she needed to do around learning more, feeling uncomfortable, and what she needed was support to continue learning these methods and being supported in those methods. And so when I reflected that back to her and said, well, actually it is working, because what you're doing is you're telling me what you learned, what you did or didn't do, and what you need now. And she was quite baffled by that. But it was a really interesting, I guess, experience around that barrier that she had, but actually that story circle process in an evaluation context actually worked really, really well. So, just to give some examples of kind of, needing to be really clear on the process and really needing to be clear on the theme. An example was, if the project, which is one that I've worked on, is about increasing your advocacy and rights to safe, accessible and inclusive water, sanitation and hygiene. And this is a project that I used participatory action research in over 5 years. And so the participants actually knew what I was talking about. They know what a PAR is and a PAR cycle is, etc., which is a participatory action research cycle. the kinds of questions that I would ask in story circles were, tell me a story about something important that happened in the action part of the last power cycle. Or tell me a story about something difficult you or your power group encountered during the last power cycle. Tell me a story about something satisfying you or your power group encountered during the last power cycle. Or tell me a story about something frustrating that you and all your power group members encountered during the last power cycle. And so if you notice, they're really specific questions related to the project, but they're also broad and open enough that participants can share their own lived experiences, their own thoughts, their own personal things about this. And it's an example of, related to the last slide around being really scared that people are going to talk about trauma or talk about other things, being really clear about what that purpose is and what that question is means that, yes, some personal things that could come up that were traumatic, but mostly it's about a really specific thing that is about their experiences in a project, evaluating what happened, what was important, what was difficult, what was satisfying, what was frustrating. And in this kind of case, when you're analysing the work, if you're doing an analysis circle for a defined process, the guideline of limited time and building on a previous statement is helpful. So, everyone has 3 minutes to tell a story, and then the next question leads on from the last question. So usually in these kinds of situations, I do story rounds of 3. You can do more, you can do less. Depends on how much time you have, how many people are in the story circle. You want to be able to get people in a rhythm enough so that you can dig deeper and deeper, but you also don't want to just tire people out and then they get, I guess, sick and bored of this process. And so often when I do those rounds of 3, the first story circle is about their first experiences, thoughts or responses. The second story circle is about how people think they, or collaboratively we, if it's a broad variety of stakeholders, should use this information. And the final story circle evaluates the actual thing being evaluated. So, for example, what's your what really stood out to you about the last power cycle? And then maybe if 2/3 of the participants say, well, what really stood out was this action we tried didn't really work. And then it's like, well, the second story circle is, well, what do we do with that information of it not working? And the third one is, well, the actual thing being evaluated is the participatory action research process, or the, PAR 4. And so is really evaluating that. And in this case, it would evaluate highly because even if it didn't work, they actually learned something. They did it themselves. It was really participatory. So just a little bit on, thinking about it in terms of assessment, in terms of monitoring, learning and evaluation. Assessment in this form is practicable. It's both practical and achievable because it takes place as part of the central evaluation. You can't do it wrong. You can't make a mistake with it. Well, you can do it wrong and you can make a mistake with it, but if you understand and can facilitate the story circle properly, nothing anyone says is wrong. It's their genuine evaluation of the process, and it's collaborative. It's endlessly adaptable in terms of who is in the circle, its purpose and questions or themes. It's really, really easy to replicate with few resources. You don't need lots of things. You just need really good considered questions and people willing to participate. Story circles by nature are really generative. They're open-ended and creative responses are generated. They capture the messiness and diversity of participant experiences, and I think that's actually a real bonus. There's actually extraordinarily large amount of data that comes out of it, if you want to think about it in those terms. The evaluations or reflections are shared immediately and publicly with those present, generating new insights and sharing more stories and speaking more stories as they share. So they generate stories. And you find this particularly in communities where someone will tell a story and the next person will say, oh, that reminds me of this. This is my experience of it. And so kind of people bounce off each other. It's democratic, especially when you give each person equal time. You give each person space. They don't have to tell a story if they don't want to. But it is democratic. Everybody gets sacred space to share their stories. Story circles center the story as a narrative form. So rather than inviting participants to answer a series of questions like yes, no, on a scale of 1 to 5, the reflections that emerge can become part of an ongoing dynamic process of personal, programmatic, and community development. So as I said, it's really iterative personally, but also within the project confines as well. What's, I guess, really good to consider is that story circles center knowledge rooted in human experience and meaning. As a sector, we continue to talk more and more about lived experience, about localization, about participation, and this is one of those methodologies that do all of that and do it really quite simply without too much resource. Story circles capture authentic and contextual information in a transparent manner. Given the correct storytelling prompts or the correct, considered storytelling questions, stories provide a great way to elicit personally meaningful representations of programs and projects and the impacts on participants' lives. It allows for more ethnographic qualitative data gathering, yielding far more contextual detail for highly complex impacts, which is, highly complex impacts is generally what happens when you're doing community development. It's just often we don't know about them because we're not creating this space for the community to be able to evaluate the impact or to share the impact. Story circles are rooted in lived experience while being genuinely collaborative. And story circles, I think, are a rigorous approach to involving valid and reliable data gathering that allows for thorough, balanced and collaborative assessment of whether projects or program goals are achieved. And I think it's valid and reliable because it's not answering your questions, they're sharing their experiences of program impacts. And so it's a much more, it's less about, I guess, those funding kind of goals around this many people participated, et cetera, but really thinking about what were people's lived experiences of this program or project and what do they think about it? Did they think it worked or not? And so in that way, I think it's very valid and very reliable. That's not to say there aren't challenges. So one challenge is that some people might not be accustomed to oral storytelling. And I'm talking about if we're trying to do this in inner city Melbourne with a bunch of executives, that might not go down so well because there's a different kind of culture around what is professional or not professional. Whereas if I'm working in Central Queensland with the Pacifica community, or I'm working in the Pacific, or I'm working in communities, people seem to be much more connected to the idea of storytelling. And again, in that kind of very Western culture, or that kind of Western norm, people might try to offer analysis rather than stories. And this is where that strong facilitation and clear communication around, I guess, the rules and the process and the method is really important. Another challenge is the differing assessment agendas, and that limits, I can't say that word right this second, reciprocity. So really what I'm saying is that the question of what counts as knowledge as data and how assessment is understood in practice highlights a challenge for different stakeholders, including when we're doing some university partnerships or with donors. Often they still have their own evaluation, and that sometimes does not align with the goals that the community set or with what they think is really important to evaluate or what they think really important outcomes are. And so there's sometimes a tension as a worker who does participatory work. One of the challenges that I face is that sometimes there's a tension between participation data that donors want to extrapolate across an array of funding programs funded. And it's about making a statement about the grant reach and impact and the value. And on the other side, value the goals as defined and driven by the community participants, and highlighting storytelling as a method that opened communication with diverse participants. And so what is the purpose of the evaluation, and who's driving that? And it's often not the communities, often it's the donors. And yeah, there's tension, and there's ongoing tension between institutional values of assessment and the arts and community-based practice. So I think that it's, just really important to think about, if you wanted to use this kind of methodology, to be really aware of what those challenges are and have really good discussions with your donors, with your partners, before you dive into it. If you're wanting to be really participatory throughout the whole project cycle, from the project design to the project evaluation, and you want to use these types of participatory methodologies, have really clear discussions with your donors and your partners around finding ways to navigate in that tension between institutional values of assessment and community-based participatory approaches. So if we don't have any questions, I do want to just acknowledge that I have a Story Circle workshop coming up on Saturday, the 22nd of June from 10 a.m. till 3:30 p.m. In Melbourne, NAM. There's a mistake there. Early bird is $125 or $75 until the 18th of May. And you can find more information on community-powered responses.com. Thank you very much.